Welcome back to Research Debrief, the podcast that bridges the gap between the fitness industry and the latest science. Luke, great to see you.
Rachel, great to see you.
All right, what research are we going to dig into today?
Yeah, this is an important paper, again, on the topic of strength training. So strength training is having a moment, incredibly popular, very important for us. This particular paper is published by a group of Stanford researchers. They're looking at, of course, a really important question: how do we do the strength training? Right now, there's a number of studies. I mean, there's a plethora of studies that address this. And this is just one of those really important studies. But again, this study is a meta-analysis. It's a collection of all the studies that have been published on this particular topic. So the title of this paper is Effects of Tempo-Controlled Resistance Training on Corticospinal Tract Plasticity in Healthy Controls, a systematic review. Now, this is published in the journal Healthcare, so this is very much a medical journal, and we should probably break down what the heck that title means. So we're talking about cortical spinal tract plasticity. Well, what the heck is that? It's simply the nervous system's ability to change the structure and function of our cortical spinal tract. This is the primary neural pathway that carries voluntary movement commands from our brain to our working muscles. So that is all we're talking about.
Very important.
Exactly, yes. How does our brain stem connect to our skeletal muscle? Now, why is this relevant in resistance training? Why are these researchers connecting this? Because in order for our muscle to contract and engage in strength training, of course, that signal starts from our brain stem. So that's kind of the terminology. When we talk about cortical spinal tract plasticity, we're talking about how do we do the strength training to improve that plasticity, to improve the ability of the brain to send meaningful information to our skeletal muscles, to make them contract more forcefully, faster, to inhibit or stop their contraction, put the brakes on their contraction. So that's the focus of the paper. Now, here's what they're looking at. They're looking at all the research that's been published on, well, what if we strength train normally, like a normal person strength trains, like we see in any club right now? It just means you lift the weight and then you lower the weight. You lift the weight and then you lower the weight. This would be considered self-paced strength training. And if we walk in any health club across the US right now, and we're just to observe people strength train, we generally see them lift the weight in about 1 second, maybe a half a second. And then they lower the weight in a second, maybe 2 seconds, sometimes a half a second. That's just self-paced strength training. They're comparing that to what they are calling tempo-controlled resistance training. And all that means is you are intentionally lifting the weight slowly, and you are intentionally lowering the weight slowly. And in all the studies, they're literally using a metronome. So they're saying, we want you to lift the weight for 4 seconds. We want you to lower the weight for 4 seconds. Now, it doesn't have to be 4 seconds. Sometimes it was 5 seconds. Sometimes it was 6 seconds. But let's be very deliberate in how we lift it and very deliberate in how we lower it. Now, they used a metronome to make sure you were actually using 4 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever the intended duration was. You don't have to use a metronome. The focus here is that you are lifting it very, very slowly and intentionally, and you're lowering it slowly and intentionally. Very different than how most people strength train. So here's what the results of this important paper are. The change in the cortical spinal excitability. So think about this as the accelerator for voluntary movement. So when we say cortical spinal excitability, just think accelerator for voluntary movement was assessed in 12 studies. We looked at 12 studies. 11 studies looked at what we call short interval intracortical inhibition. This is just the opposite of that accelerator. This is the brakes for our voluntary movement. So most of the studies looked at how do we accelerate it. A few of the studies also looked at how do we put the brakes on, okay, after we do a strength training program. 7 of the studies in this meta-analysis also looked at, well, what was better for actually getting stronger? So here's the outcome. Across 12 studies, an increase in this cortical spinal excitability, this is the accelerator for voluntary movement, was observed, okay? So let me go through that again. Throughout the 12 studies, an increase in this voluntary movement and a decrease in the braking were found. okay, where the cortical spinal excitability and the short interval intracortical inhibition were deemed unchanged within the control group, the people that didn't strength train, or the self-paced training groups. Let's make sense of all that. In the studies, the people that did self-paced strength training received no benefit in terms of this improvement in the cortical spinal tract plasticity. And the groups that strength trained slowly, they lifted the weight slowly and they lowered the weight slowly, they had statistical significant improvements. So that is really interesting. That's the cortical spinal tract plasticity. Now let's comment on strength. Strength increased throughout both the metronome pace and the self-paced strength training groups. That makes sense. If you strength train, you're going to get stronger. The group that used the metronome also got stronger. However, a statistically significant difference between the groups existed, with a more significant increase in strength amongst the group that used the metronome paced approach. This is fascinating. So not only did you improve cortical spinal tract plasticity, right, your ability to accelerate the contraction in that signal and also brake, but you got much stronger if you lifted weights slowly and you lowered the weights slowly. So that's our take-home message, right? Now, we are kind of societally understanding that resistance training is important. These particular researchers are saying we have to move forward. How do we get more out of this? And of course, we do this across all populations. Now, this paper was among healthy males and females. They go on to say we should do this research on people with injuries as well. Yeah. And they start to pontificate or hypothesize that we probably even see better outcomes for people that are injured, right? And they talk about people with different tendinopathies, right? So maybe you have an Achilles injury, Achilles pain, really, really common in active adults as we get older and you're running and active, and we might have an Achilles injury. And they create a pretty good case for why this might be more relevant in that population. Now, let's be clear, they did not do the research on that population. This is in healthy adults. So Rachel, I think our big take home here is we understand that strength training is good for us. We as operators should think about, well, how can we instruct our consumer in a way to do it more effectively, to get more out of their strength training? And this important meta-analysis says lift the weight much slower, lower the weight much slower. Now, one of the reasons I think this is so important is nobody is doing this. You will be hard pressed to walk into a health club anywhere and see people doing this. And so this is the purpose of our podcast together, right? We could take all this scientific research and we could apply it in our clubs. I guarantee you these researchers are saying, hey, we published this big meta-analysis. I wish health clubs would pick it up and bring it to their members, because as we've said repeatedly on this podcast, health clubs, gyms, fitness studios of all kind, we are the conduit to the consumer, right? Researchers are publishing the research. It stops there if we don't pick it up and actually share it with our consumer.
Yeah, most definitely. All right, so big takeaway is you need to be coaching on pacing, in addition to a lot of the other things that we've talked about in regards to strength training in previous episodes. So I'd encourage everyone to check those out. Yeah, wow, okay, very interesting. Awesome. Thanks, Luke.